All right, so here we go with section three, talking about winning the war. So remember how we said at the end of video one that enthusiasm at the beginning of the war was very high. Well, by 1917, 3 years later, that had changed significantly. Nations had to start changing their strategies as to how the war could be won. And even before 1917, many of the countries involved in the war had adopted a policy called total war. Now, total war is when all of a nation's resources go into a war effort. An example is that all of the nations, except for Great Britain, mandated a conscription, meaning a draft. Okay, saying that all available men had to register and be eligible to serve in the military. Also, governments organized their economies to win the war. Excuse me. Things like rationing. Okay, you see this poster from Britain at the time: "Save the wheat, help the fleet, eat less bread." Controlling the amount of resources, food and fuel and things like that people would use so that it could be used for the war effort and the soldiers. Higher taxes were imposed. Businesses were forced to produce goods for the war effort. Things like that. Total war also means controlling public opinion. Governments censored the press, and they also used propaganda. Now, propaganda, remember, are images, whether it's posters, whether it's movies, newspapers, things like that are meant to both create enthusiasm for the war and to damage an opposing cause. All right, so here you see German propaganda telling them to fight for the fatherland, and then there's the famous American propaganda that came out from this time. Good old Uncle Sam, I want you for the U.S. Army. Propaganda, it can be used to motivate people, as these are, try and get people fired up to serve. It can also make the opponent seem like a monster, literally in this case. Let me move me out of the way here. Where's the mouse? Here we go. Okay, destroy this mad brute, enlist. That is meant to represent, you can tell by the pointed cap up in the top, it's meant to represent German, right? So we've got the Germans representing some monstrous ape, culture, this bloody club here, destroying culture and so forth. So it was meant to get people to think that they are really fighting evil in doing it. All right, so if a government wants its entire nation involved in total war, then it's not just the men who need to support the war effort, but also it's the women as well. The most important role women played was in filling the jobs of the men off fighting. They went to work in the factories. Women were not allowed to serve in militaries, but they did act as nurses, kind of helping to dress wounds and so forth. And both of these gave women a sense of pride, and later on it fed into a growing call for a political equality, namely the right to vote, that we're going to be talking about in later chapters. Now, despite inspiring propaganda, by 1917, both sides saw a significant decline in morale. Right? Morale are your feelings towards this. This was largely due to what is called war fatigue. Fatigue is when you're tired of something, and people were getting tired of this war. The war had been going on for several years, and neither side saw much of a change. Casualties also were ridiculously high due to the new weapons being used, and people at home were experiencing shortages of food and fuel. So you've got these guys coming back with horrible injuries. They're talking about how not much is getting done, and it's really making people question, is this worth it? What are we doing with all of this? Another major blow that was dealt to the Allies was the Russian Revolution in 1917. Now, we're going to be talking about this a lot more in a later section. In fact, we're going to spend an entire section talking about this later on in the chapter. But for now, it's important to know that due to the revolution, Russia drops out of the war. So Germany now no longer had to fight a two-front war, and things looked bad for the Allies, namely Britain and France. However, the fate of the war would change again, though, when the U.S. joins the war. Now, for the first 3 years of the war, the U.S. had maintained a strong policy of neutrality, meaning they were not going to get involved. But a series of events brought them into conflict. One was the sinking of the Lusitania. The Lusitania was a British passenger ship that was sunk by a German U-boat in 1915. There were 128 Americans on board. American President Woodrow Wilson strongly condemned it and put a lot of pressure on Germany to end what was called its unrestricted submarine warfare, these attacks that they were having on the Atlantic. And Germany agreed to do this for a while. But a couple of years later, in 1917, Germany resumes its unrestricted submarine warfare and just started attacking everything that it came across in the Atlantic because it was desperate to gain an advantage due to the stalemate happening at the Western Front. So this put American ships in danger again. Another reason was this thing called the Zimmerman telegram. Here's a copy of it. You can even kind of see some of the language that I'll be referring to here. In 1917, the British government claimed to have intercepted a letter from German Minister Arthur Zimmermann sent to the Mexican government. It supposedly requested that Mexico help out Germany and also possibly even stage an attack on the American southern border. And in return, Germany would help Mexico gain back its lost territories, such as states, like Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and so forth. When the note became public in the U.S., a lot of Americans started now calling for outright war with Germany. So, in April of 1917, the U.S. formally declares war against Germany, and they go out. The Doughboys, as they were called, are going out to war. Now, it took the U.S. months to mobilize and get the troops to Europe, though, and they didn't really get there until the beginning of 1918. Even though the U.S. wasn't involved in World War I for even a complete year, it still had a tremendous impact. There we go. On turning the tide in favor of the Allies. All right, so we weren't there for a very long time, but we played a very important role in the outcome of it. So, just gave you a spoiler alert that the Allies win. Now let's talk about the Allied victory. By spring of 1918, the German army was exhausted. Knowing that the Americans were coming, they tried to stage a very, very large offensive into French territory. Was somewhat successful, but not that successful. They didn't go far enough in that it really made that much of a difference by the time the American troops arrived to reinforce the British and the French. And it just didn't have the long-term impact that the Germans hoped that it could. And then by September 1918, the German military command, here's the German military commanders on the left and right, and the Kaiser, all right, Kaiser Wilhelm II here in the middle, they advised him that it was a lost cause. The war could not be won. And so in November of 1918, the Kaiser abdicated the throne, meaning he gave up the throne and he lived the rest of his life in exile in the Netherlands. Also, in Austria-Hungary, the government was overthrown. The Habsburg family was overthrown due to internal rebellion. Remember, we talked about that in the first section, about all the different groups within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Well, they overthrew the Habsburgs. And so basically the Central Powers are done at this point. The Ottoman Empire is ready to submit. And so in November of 1918, actually move up here because I'll put some pictures of that, where I'm going to be. Germany agrees to an armistice, which is a ceasefire, and so this ends the war. Right, so you've got the celebrations in Paris of people going nuts on the double-decker bus. You've got the headlines all over the world of peace, and that the war is now over. So a much bigger issue is going to come up next, though, of what to do, in making this peace and creating a long-lasting peace. And we're going to be talking about that in the next video.